Hello and welcome to World History B, Unit 8, the Cold War in Europe. So the Cold War is a long period in history that followed the end of World War II. It would have been nice if at the end of World War II we had finally achieved world peace. The democratic countries and the communist countries had been working together, helping each other. Japan wasn't a communist country, but after losing the war, America helped build them back up and became close friends with them. It just looked like a great time to finally figure out how to work together globally. But unfortunately, tensions between West and East were just too great to overcome. And the Cold War describes a time when the major superpowers, in particular America and the Soviet Union, were at odds with each other, but because of the devastation of World War II, were afraid to directly go head-to-head, so they found many other ways to fight their war. Now I just want to remind you what communism is, a way of organizing a society in which the government owns the things that are used to make and transport products. That means businesses. The government owns them all. Unlike in America, where the government owns some, if you form a business, it's not going to belong to the government unless you sell it to the government. Because there's no privately owned property. There's no classes, no rich, no middle, no poor in a communist nation. There's just one class and everybody's the same, even if that same is not very good. So the first crack in the relationship between East and West was the Yalta Conference, February 1945. With Nazi Germany gone, there was no more enemies. So the Soviet Union, led by Stalin, and America, led by Truman, and England, led by Winston Churchill, had to figure out what to do with Germany. So they divided it into zones of occupation controlled by Allied military forces. The Western countries, like England and US, would control the western half, and Russia, the Soviet Union, would control the eastern half. Now, in this division, in this compromise, Stalin promised that those living on the east half of Germany would have free elections and that he would not impose communism upon them. Unfortunately, Stalin had no interest in keeping that promise. The United States had a major interest after World War II, and that was preventing the spread of communism. Also, developing trading partners to get materials in markets, which can't be done with communist nations that don't have markets. Or if the government's controlling all raw materials and there's no businesses to deal with, then one leader deciding it doesn't like your country can decide not to trade with you, anything that country produces. And America realized the best way to get raw materials and open new markets was to rebuild European governments and reunite Germany. It did not want Germany, did not see Germany being forever divided. But the Soviet Union wanted communism across the globe. They wanted to rebuild an Eastern Europe under a communist ideology. And the main reason was to protect Russia, so that the betrayal of Hitler could never happen again, because there'd be a big enough buffer zone between Russia and who it perceived to be its enemies in the West, the United States, England, France, and that's why it wanted to keep Germany divided. It's not that the Soviet Unions were these evil people that just want to subjugate everything. It's just after the betrayal of Hitler and losing 28 million people, they kind of went overboard with the paranoia and wanted to make sure they had a ton of protection so that it could never ever happen again. And so fell the Iron Curtain. This is a metaphor that represented Europe's division into mostly the democratic West and the communist East. The Soviets controlled the eastern part. And in reaction to the alliance of the Western democratic countries, the Soviet Union formed a pact known as the Warsaw Pact. This was a pact with its neighboring countries saying, if you go communist, which at the Yalta Conference they had promised not to do, but they made the deal with these countries right here down the middle, that if they went communist, the Soviet Union would guarantee their protection. Now, some countries were kind of forced to go communist, like East Germany didn't really have a chance. Countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, where they were also kind of forced. These countries, even the ones that weren't directly forced, they were too afraid to go against the Soviet Union, sharing a border with it. And so the Warsaw Pact was founded, and this was Russia's buffer zone. This was how they felt they would protect themselves, so that if the West ever attacked them again, like what Germany had in World War II, they'd have all this territory to get through before they could get to Russia, the Soviet Union, giving the Soviet Union plenty of time to prepare and never be surprised again. Of course, this just made the US even more scared that, oh wow, they're growing, they're expanding, we've got to contain this. So the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union got worse over 1946 and 1947 as the goals of the countries became increasingly at odds going in this opposite direction. As the goals of the two countries became increasingly more at odds. President Truman even adopted a foreign policy called containment that he announced to the world with the goal of blocking Soviet influence and stopping the expansion of communism, forming its own alliances to try to help prevent weaker countries, smaller countries unable to defend themselves from becoming communist and therefore allies of the Soviet Union, which was now officially America's enemy. And so the Cold War divided the world. This is where the term First World and Third World comes from. First World being the democratic and Soviet countries that were at the top. And every other country that those nations like China, Soviet Union, America were fighting over, that's the Third World. So a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, countries in Africa, these are countries that were not financially, not economically very strong. It would have been very difficult for them to resist militarily against the power against either the West or the East. These are the Third World nations. And that's why Third World nations tend to be poorer nations, because these were the battlegrounds that America and Soviet Union would fight over. But as I've said before, Russia and America knew better than to go directly head-to-head and engage in outright war against each other. Instead, a lot of their tactics, their strategies include spying, propaganda, diplomacy, secret operations, and this went on from 1941 to 1991. And the biggest reason the two major superpowers refused to go head-to-head and all-out war against each other is because of a concept known as MAD, mutually assured destruction. Both sides had atomic bombs, both sides had militaries that were becoming much more technically advanced and much more destructive compared to what they were in World War II, that both countries knew they could not afford to fight each other because the winner would be so devastated and would have taken so many huge hits, it wouldn't have felt like winning because their economy, their nations could potentially be in ruins even if they technically won a war. Finally, in 1953, Stalin died and his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, took over. He became the dominant leader. He denounced Stalin and actually started to try to erase him from cities by taking down statues, tried to basically wipe him from the history books to some degree, and really set the tone for the Cold War. The Soviet Union under Khrushchev was an economic and military force, every bit as powerful and influential as America. And this is what made both sides so scared of each other, because both sides realized they were dealing with their equal. And that's it for this video. If you have any questions, let me know in class. Thank you.